Representative Angela Romero, and we welcome you here today. We'll start approval of the August 30th minutes, 2023. Would you like to make the motion to approve those minutes?
I move that we approve the minutes from August 30th, 2023.
Okay, so all in favor of the approval of the minutes, say aye. 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 Opposed, if any, they will be approved as they are. We'll go ahead and move to Nicole Martins-Rogers, the research scientist from Wild Earth Research, as well as Jesse Austin, if you guys would announce who you are and who you represent so that the people out there listening will know. Pull it up close because it's hard to.
Good morning. I'm Nicole Martin-Rogers. I'm a research scientist at Wilder Research, which is a nonprofit organization based in St. Paul. And I'm a descendant of White Earth Nation, which is an Ojibwe tribe located in northern Minnesota.
And my name is Jesse Austin, and I'm also a research scientist at Wilder Research.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the effort of being here and for all the work that you've been doing for us. And I know you've traveled a long ways. And so where are you ladies from?
St. Paul.
St. Paul, Minnesota.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Probably a heat wave here then, huh? Probably.
It's actually kind of warm right now in St. Paul too, surprisingly, for
Is it?
November.
Okay.
It's been in the 60s, but yeah, it'll get chilly soon.
Well,
Feels great
glad
here.
to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Okay, the time's yours.
Okay, thank you for having us here today, and thanks to the task force and the Utah legislature for allowing us to work with you on this project. So the task force has already seen a lot of this content, so we'll go over pretty quickly and just show you what's new. But just a reminder that we were contracted to help with the research for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Task Force. And so today we, again, we'll just go really quickly through some of these pieces that you all have seen before, the background and how we got to this point here. And then we'll really focus on the updated and final recommendations along with the final draft report that we're submitting for your approval today.
Okay.
So the background is that the Utah legislature created this task force, which was changed to MMIR, standing for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives, in 2023. And Wilder Research was contracted to examine the scope and nature of the MMIR injustice and to make recommendations for improvements. And this report covers 9 major themes or topic areas, really focusing on the first few of after someone has been murdered or has gone missing or died under other suspicious circumstances, in the investigation process and the communication and alert systems used and all those things.
So we began the research process by doing a thorough review of the literature related to state and federal policies that were relevant to the issue, as well as best practices. And then we dove into what's happening on the ground here in Utah by interviewing 28 different experts who represented law enforcement, tribal leadership, tribal liaisons, as well as death investigators, attorneys, advocates, social service providers, and others. We also, in partnership with Restoring Ancestral Winds, who are a subcontractor on this project, held a listening session in Bluff, Utah with family members and community members, as well as social service providers, back in July, over the summer. And then we also reviewed the notes and audio recordings from the listening sessions that were held at task force meetings over the past several years. And then we conducted qualitative analysis of all of this research material to identify key findings from the interviews, listening sessions, and public comment sessions, and formulate key findings and recommendations. So you will see that in the report for each topic area, we provide an overview of the state and federal policy landscape. We discuss best and emerging practices in the field. We talk about current issues happening here in Utah, and then we provide recommendations for consideration. So up to this point, the report, a draft of the report was reviewed by task force members and other experts, and we incorporated their feedback. We also sent the report to tribal leadership in the state, And they had the opportunity to provide feedback both in written form and as well as at the Utah Tribal Leadership Meeting on the 20th of October. And then here we are today for our final presentation. Any final feedback and hopefully approval from the task force. So just a few limitations to quickly mention. We want to be clear that the focus of this report was primarily on the system response, both the legal and social service system response, after someone has already gone missing or been the victim of violence, and we want to emphasize that further research is needed into underlying factors that contribute to our Indigenous relatives being at higher risk of victimization in the first place. We also wanted to note some limitations and benefits of Nicole and I and our other colleagues being an out-of-state research team. So we did need to dive in very quickly to understand the local landscape here in Utah and learn very quickly, just not having that immediate local expertise. Additionally, our distance, being located in Minnesota, limited our opportunities for in-person engagement and interaction with experts and community members. However, we feel that our independent positionality, not having any interpersonal or political ties to Utah, may have given people the opportunity to speak more freely than they may have otherwise had a research firm from Utah with connections and investment in the state conducted this research. And additionally, in particular, Nicole Martin Rogers brought a breadth and depth of expertise to this issue that greatly aided in our ability to dive in and conduct this research in such a short time frame. And then we also wanted to emphasize that ongoing discussion with and feedback from tribal leaders is imperative to moving forward on this issue and has been specifically requested by several tribal leaders, that is like independent individual meetings, to make sure that any future actions taken by the task force reflect the needs and priorities of each individual tribal community. And so when formulating these recommendations, we took in information from all sorts of information sources. So the literature, from experts on the ground, and through quite a few discussions with task force members and experts. And when we formulated the recommendations that we're presenting to you today, we wanted to make sure that they are based and grounded in the research literature, that we can back up what we're saying with what is known to be effective or a promising practice by experts in the field, that our recommendations are aligned with, or at least not contradictory with, what's happening on the ground here in Utah by advocates and legislatures and others involved in the issue, and that our recommendations are clear and actionable. But we also did want to emphasize that these actions should be taken only after formal consultation with tribes, and that as is best practice, they should be led and informed by survivors and be victim-centered and trauma-informed, as well as informed by the historical context. So we did present recommendations to you back in August, but a lot has happened since then. So we received feedback from task force members on the draft recommendations, as well as other experts who we interviewed. We held a series of extended working group meetings, which task force members and other experts attended to further discuss and refine the recommendations. We've held several interviews since the draft report was first presented to you, and we also received feedback from tribal leadership on the draft report. And so what we're presenting today are our updated recommendations, which are highlighted in red on each slide. However, we do encourage you to look at the recommendations as a whole, as these do align with what's presented in the report. And we want to make sure that you're comfortable with what we're putting forward and that you feel comfortable standing behind what is presented here today and in the report. So we're going to dive in. So first, with the section related to preliminary missing person reporting and investigation, our recommendations are largely aligned with what was presented before. So exploring tribes' interest in developing tribal community response plans, ensuring that best practices are followed across law enforcement jurisdictions in Utah, building trust, and increasing education and communication with families about requirements for the Utah Missing Person Clearinghouse. But through all of the feedback mechanisms that I just described, we were able to further refine our recommendation related to Utah state law and requirements for preliminary missing person investigation. So currently, Utah state law does require that law enforcement agencies enter all missing person cases into the National Crime Information Center, which is a really crucial database that allows for communication about missing person cases across jurisdictions. However, we feel that this law could be further refined and strengthened by specifying that all missing person reports should require a preliminary investigation so that officers can, for all cases where their location and well-being is undetermined, and require immediate entry of all individuals determined to be missing and endangered into NCIC. And so we're hoping that this recommendation closes a couple of gaps, both through ensuring that when a missing person report is made, there is diligence in following up on that report and consistency in that diligence across all jurisdictions in Utah, so that some missing persons reports, just due to the circumstances or personal biases of the law enforcement, aren't overlooked or dismissed and not investigated properly. And then ensuring that the cases that are entered into NCIC are the folks who are missing and endangered, and that they're entered in a timely manner. Next, for the communication and alert systems, largely aligned with what you've seen before. A lot of our recommendations are related to determining barriers to full utilization of Utah's existing alert systems to make sure that they're accessible and unbiased. However, we were able to further expand on this recommendation by adding a recommendation, if of tribal interest, offering training for tribal and BIA law enforcement officers on the state Amber Alert system, criteria and procedures for activation to ensure that that is not a barrier to children on tribal lands being reported and initiating the Amber Alert system.
So next, we're going to talk about cold cases or unresolved cases. And through the feedback that we received from some task force members in the process that Jesse described, we had previously just recommended expanding the cold case review board, but we kind of made that even a little bit more expansive, I guess you could say, so that there's now a consideration to create a statewide cold case unit, which would actually have sworn law enforcement officers and analysts that would staff that, as opposed to the cold case review board that's currently in place and has been really seen to be quite effective, but it just doesn't have the capacity, or in some cases the law enforcement credentials, to do the all of the cold case reviews. So in this way, all unresolved MMIR cases could be brought in front of some type of a review committee and have a chance to have those cases re-looked at and potentially solved. And that cold case review board does have a very good solve rate. So the next topic is related to death investigation. And one of the things that we've looked at from the beginning is just, and you know, we've heard this in Utah and we also heard it in Minnesota, that a lot of times it's the communication process between families and the Office of the Medical Examiner or law enforcement. And you know, it's a very, very technical process, and some of the terminology that's used is different than layperson terminology. And families oftentimes don't feel satisfied that they've received all the answers that they wanted to receive, or that they've actually understood what happened in their loved one's investigation process. And so that's one of the first recommendations. In terms of addition that we made based on feedback recently, If of tribal interest, there would be an opportunity to provide more training so that in Indian country, where right now there isn't current presence of staff that have that training to do that preliminary death investigation and to do it according to best practices. So the recommendation is to provide more training for tribal staff so that staff that are right there at the location on the reservation would be able to start some of those preliminary steps of collecting the evidence. Because that's one thing that we know is really important, is if there's, right from the beginning, when an incident happens, someone dies under suspicious circumstances, we want to make sure that evidence is collected and the scene is documented in a certain way, because you can't go back after the fact and recreate those things. So.
Hold on just a minute on that one. We have no jurisdiction on tribal lands, and so how do we go about that as a state? I mean, what are you suggesting that we do there? I mean, that's Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I mean, even our San Juan County Sheriff has no jurisdiction, basically,
Right.
to investigate or to open a cold case. I mean, where could we go as a state to help with that? Because that's under the Department of Interior.
Yeah, I think with almost all of these recommendations, this one in particular, but others as well, that the first step is just opening up that conversation with the tribe and seeing what, even if if the tribes are interested, one of them might be interested or all of them might be interested. And once a tribe is interested, receiving that training would have to be worked out of who would provide it and things like that. But it's something that certainly the state can't just come in, or one of your counties can't just go in and say, you know, we're gonna start training.
It's not gonna happen.
It would be more of a relationship building process and assessing if that was something that was of interest to the tribes and if that was something that they would want to do to have.
Well, that's the sad part. It's not even the tribe. I mean, we're talking to the Department of the Interior.
Right.
I mean, President you and President Nez, we tried to work with them, and I mean, they're hamstrung. I mean, as far as being able to.
As far as actual law enforcement jurisdiction and authority, I'm not sure if that would pertain to providing training to tribal staff, though, right? So certainly.
Well, tribal staff, but a lot of the law enforcement, isn't it part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs? I mean, is it regulated by maybe I need to be more informed of what's going on, but I've talked to, when President Nez was there, I mean, he didn't really have a lot to, as far as training of their officers and stuff like that. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
are they
again, I
tribal
think
or are
it's
they
not
federal?
something.
Are they federal officers? I mean, I don't understand.
It's tribal at Navajo. It's tribal law enforcement. There's also federal authority.
But the
there as well.
FBI is actually the one in charge. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is the ones that are basically the ones that does the investigating of any missing. It's not really tribal. I mean, I don't understand. I guess that's maybe.
I think we have some members that,
Oh, all right. Maybe we could go to them. They probably know more than
Just
I do
to-
about it, so.
Maybe to help answer your question, the Federal Bureau of Investigation certainly has jurisdiction to investigate deaths on tribal lands, but our understanding is that they are contacted by first responding law enforcement on the ground and brought in afterward.
What I'm saying
Oh,
is,
sorry.
they're not gonna sit and listen to Utah come and sit, I mean, they're not gonna have us tell them, hey, you guys need to start a better training program. I mean, they're not gonna even hear it, right? I mean, we got other, let's go to the
Let's go to
online.
Caitlin
Maybe they
first, yeah.
can help me, I don't know. Caitlin, would you like to?
Yeah, apologies, I was having some sound issues. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me.
I
can
can,
hear you.
yep.
So in the past, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has actually reached out to the State of Utah Attorney General's office through our Human Trafficking Task Force. And they've requested that we come in and we talk with them about what we do within the state in the organization of our state task force. So there is definitely an interest from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to have a stronger relationship in terms of training. And there definitely is an opportunity there to build that relationship. In the past, I believe we've gone down, I'm gonna be wrong on this, but I think it was out in Vernal and Duchesne area. And we've met with, county, city, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they all had a vested interest in expanding both their knowledge bank on the human trafficking side of things, as well as creating a more interconnected way to discuss and sort of organize a response to these issues.
Thanks, Caitlin. And appreciate that.
I think Yolanda had a comment as well.
Yolanda? Ms. Nez?
Hello.
There you go.
Hello, Senator and everyone. I think what we do have is now an ability, of course, to strengthen our relationships with tribal members and tribal governments, and also those who work in combination with state, county, city law enforcement when it comes to the safety of Indigenous people in the state of Utah. And one thing that is critical, I believe, is that when we have individuals or organizations, tribal governments who know and understand where state government is coming from, they understand the contents of the report. And to the Nicole's point about relationship building, I think is absolutely critical, because in order to have these conversations with officials who are empowered to make these decisions for the tribal members, I think that having that trust and ability with the familiar face, um, understanding what historical trauma is, and moving forward on the state side, and having these relationships continuously be reinforced and, if I may add, nurtured, so that the trust can be built. And that takes some heavy lifting. We may have solutions, but of course, we can't do what we've done in the past, which is assert our power in places that it isn't welcome. But again, where the emphasis, I think, can really play a part is in building these relationships with law enforcement on all sides, in all places in the state of Utah, whether that be in the city, in the state, on tribal land. Our interests, I think, is really protect the people. And the only law enforcement agency in our entire state that is run by a tribe is the Navajo Nation. And it's just a sliver of the state of Utah. However, that doesn't remove our responsibility to the constituents who live and reside in nearby cities and towns all over the state of Utah. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, sorry to interrupt, but you're telling us to do something that I don't know that we have the authority or to be able to do.
Yep, so the major bullet point there is to just expand on the working relationships between
Okay.
the tribes in Utah, and then explore the tribal interest, I think. But certainly none of these recommendations in here are trying to imply that the state has any authority to tell the tribes what to do. So there's a couple items on this that might require financial support, which could be related to some legislative action that could be taken. One thing is just in general, law enforcement jurisdictions in rural Utah in particular need to have increased access to investigative technology and training about how to do those investigations. So there's in many rural parts of the country, there's slower law enforcement response time. And then if you have a law enforcement officer who's never dealt with a missing person case before, or hasn't had one for 7 years or something, trying to remember what are the steps I'm supposed to take and what are the current best practices can be really challenging. So just making sure that that training is available and the technology is available. And then one specific item that we uncovered in this review process is that there's a $2,500 fee associated with the Office of Medical Examiner to do a death investigation. And so again, if the tribes need that, they have to pay that fee to get a death investigation. And in some cases that may be
We have one question.
Yeah, I have a question about the fee for the medical examiner's office. Historically, do you know in Utah how many tribes have been able to cover the $2,500 fee, and if it was part of how are they able to do so? Because obviously tribes, we're sovereign, but then we have a pot of money and everything's distributed based off of budgetary guidelines. Do you know what guidelines or what what pot of money? Like, did it come out of the Department of Justice funding? Did it come out of HHS? And I'm only asking this because I know tribes will often wonder themselves, where are we going to get this money to get $2,500? And I know it doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're a smaller tribe with not great economic resources, that could be a lot of money.
Absolutely.
Have to rob a casino in Wendover.
Yes.
So I do not know the specific pot of funding. Our understanding is that BIA and the FBI contract with Utah OME to conduct death investigations related to homicides and suspicious deaths. But I don't know any of the specifics, I'm afraid, about how much funding they have allocated to each tribe, and we suspect it's likely a barrier to utilizing Utah's Office of the Medical Examiner more frequently.
Okay, and so then would BIA or FBI, are they the ones picking up the tabs and not specifically the tribe?
I don't know the answer to that.
I don't think we know the answer to that. I think that's an excellent question.
Okay.
Put that on your to-do list.
Yep. All right, I'll keep moving here. So this next topic area is about the government-to-government collaboration. And again, this is probably one of the biggest overarching recommendations in the report, is to just improve communication and strengthen relationships across jurisdictions. Because of course, when you're in a situation that's highly stressful or under duress, like a child has gone missing and jurisdictions are trying to figure out who does what, who has what authority where, it's already a stressful situation. And if you have those relationships established prior and have some documented way of cross-jurisdiction collaboration, it can smooth out that when you do end up having some type of a crisis like a missing child in a community. There's some specific examples like MOUs or cross-deputization, state recognition of tribal law enforcement. There's a lot of different options, and so the recommendation is for the state to explore what these options are to both increase collaboration, increase access to law enforcement resources in Indian country and in some of the more rural areas in Utah, and also just reducing barriers for tribal law enforcement to become more effective. And then there was also a specific recommendation through a kind of late interview that came in that there's really a lot of opportunity, it seems like, with the Department of Public Safety Tribal Liaison to increase some collaboration with federal, state, county, local law enforcement agencies. And so that's a particular position that you all already have in place that could kind of facilitate some of that a little bit. The next red recommendation, this came from the tribal leaders meeting that we attended on October 20th, is that at least 3 tribes requested in-person meetings between their tribe and the task force, because a lot of the tribes, I think, felt like you can't come up with one recommendation that would be equally applicable and relevant to all the tribes. So rather than trying to come up with something blanket, you need to have those in-person one-on-one meetings and understand how these issues are going to uniquely impact each tribe. And then the last bullet, which I wanted to call your attention to, is sort of a late addition, but I think a really important one, is to create a state-level position that's focused on MMIR issues to make sure that some of these recommendations that are made here, that there's someone who's kind of a point person and coordinating across the different agencies to
Hang on a second.
move that forward.
Our problem is that our state troopers don't get involved with this as much as our county sheriff's departments. And so we got 29 counties, and for us to be able to coordinate, and they're all pretty much independent, and they don't want to be told by the state how to run their counties.
Yep.
And so how do we go about that? I mean, as far as you say, we need to have one person. I mean, they have a sheriff's association who's, I think Sheriff Curtis is president or something right now, but.
I think with the position, and this was something that was heard across all different forums of different people that our research team interviewed, is really not just talking about the jurisdiction issues, it's just talking about just communication in general with our Indian Affairs Office, with other areas, but specifically focusing on murdered and missing Indigenous relatives, because everyone's so spread thin. We have, a few staff are on Indian Affairs, but they have a lot of things that they're doing on behalf of the state. So this particular position would focus on, and would most likely be housed in CCJJ, would be focusing on domestic violence, sexual assault, and working with DPS's tribal liaison and others in the health department, so that we're kind of bringing it all together, so that we are a task force, and we're hoping to extend the task force for another 2 years, because now that this report's come out, we've had a lot of leaders from our different communities, for different tribal leaders wanting to have more input. So we definitely want to continue that effort, because I don't feel like we're done, but the staffer position would have more time to do the stuff you and I can't do, because we're responsible for a lot of things and coordinate with our Indian Affairs office, coordinate with our health department, and coordinate with the Attorney General's office. And we've seen this happen in Minnesota and some other states. And, Arizona reached out to me recently, and they want to work with us, and they're trying to do a Four Corners kind of task force where we're all coming together. And so having a full-time staffer specifically focused on murdered and missing relatives is really important, from what we've heard from everyone we've basically interviewed, because all of us are so spread thin doing our full-time jobs and our legislative jobs and all the other things that, as a task force, it's hard sometimes for us to be able to do all the things that we'd like to do.
I have a quick question. So I know jurisdiction is always and will always be an issue. In other states, because I didn't read this in the report, but in other states with cross-deputization, did they see an increase in any barriers that currently have been taking place? Because I know Minnesota obviously has cross-deputization with like Fond du Lac and I'm trying to remember.
Leech Lake.
Yeah. And so has it gotten better with those collaborations and developing those MOUs? Or MOUs.
Yeah, so I think that definitely talking to like the police chief at Leech Lake Reservation, where those officers are cross-deputized with the state, they have full access to all the state data systems and stuff, which I think is one thing that in the next slide you'll see is a pretty big issue with the MMIR injustice, that a lot of times the cases with Indigenous relatives aren't reported or aren't reported timely. Or aren't updated when they are taken down, or all sorts of other stuff with the data. And so that's a big factor that has been important in Minnesota. And then I also think that you can see in Minnesota where there's variation with the tribes and the counties that they share geography with. In some cases, there's very strong collaborative working relationships, and they can immediately figure out what they need to do by working together during a crisis. And then there's other communities where there is not a good relationship, or even like a tenuous relationship between like the county sheriff and the tribal leadership and things, and that it results in cases getting stymied. So I mean, you can see that play out across the different tribes in Minnesota, which is obviously different because we're a public law 280 state, but so the
Tyler?
counties do have jurisdiction.
You know more about this than anybody that I know of. Could you kind of help us, guide us on this a little bit?
Yeah, and is this on? Yeah.
It should be on.
So I think the challenge we're seeing here is number one, we talk about jurisdiction, and we talk about sovereignty, and we're talking about federal resources and state resources and county resources. The challenge is always going to be relationships, and then really good, strong MOUs that kind of outline what is a state, and for us, for DPS, what is it that we can do for, let's say, Navajo PD? What is the expectation with that MOU? As far as cross-deputization or, police powers, that's a whole nother discussion to have with post and certification and how that works. We're certainly open to those discussions. I don't think that's should be a barrier. But
The question
there's a
is,
challenge there.
how do we get a hold of somebody at the FBI that would even be involved as that? I mean,
So the FBI, they have their own tribal liaison person assigned here locally in the area, and we have a really good, DPS has a really great relationship with the FBI,
okay.
and so there's opportunity, I think, there to I guess make recommendations and say, hey, we're seeing a gap. This report says there's gaps. How can DPS and the FBI and BIA and Navajo PD and the county sheriffs, how can we collaboratively come together and address some of these issues that are here? And is it state code that needs to change? And if so, what is that specific state code that can address some of those issues and not go beyond where we're supposed to go? So I think there's opportunity there, but we have a great relationship with
Okay.
the FBI. So
That's good to know.
there's ways we can work through this.
Okay, thank you.
So the next topic that we'll cover in the report is data issues, and these are the recommendations that you'll see in the report. The one that has been added at the bottom in red is considering to add a specialized state analyst position that would be dedicated to collecting, analyzing, and reporting data back to tribes. This is a little bit general in my mind, like I wasn't sure if this was specific to MMIR issues or if the recommendation was more broad than that. I know that we had, like in Minnesota, we had analysts and epidemiologists that were assigned to report back to the tribes of their specific COVID-related data that the tribes then really appreciated and were like, we want more reporting on this and this data. And so I'm not sure how broad you all wanted to get there, but this is how it's worded in the report right now. Pass it to Jesse for the last couple of slides here.
Okay.
So for our recommendations related to victim and family services, we were able to further specify our recommendation related to utilization of the Crime Victims Reparation Program, which is a huge source of support in Utah. We've heard, though, that there's opportunities to increase outreach and communications to build awareness of how that fund can be used for traditional medicine and other healing services for Indigenous community members. And then additionally, we identified that there's opportunities to increase victims' access to flexible emergency funds, which may better help meet their needs in a more immediate and responsive way than some of the existing funding streams that take more time and are limited in terms of what services can be provided. In terms of prevention, just a few differences in our recommendations that we wanted to point out. In terms of creating and providing comprehensive supports for victims of trafficking, Utah's had a lot of wonderful advances legislatively in increasing protections for victims of trafficking in recent years, especially for victims of trafficking under the age of 18. But we'd encourage the task force and legislatures to explore opportunities to further strengthen and expand those legal protections. We'd also recommend increasing collaboration to address the intersection of child protection, human trafficking, and the MMIR injustice, because we know from the research and on the ground that a lot of children who are involved in the foster care system are at increased risk of exploitation and going missing and facing other forms of violence. We'd also recommend within the scope of this recommendation related to identifying and intervening with those at high risk for continued violence and victimization. So once some form of violence has occurred, taking action to prevent further victimization. We'd recommend that Utah do further research to identify trafficking hotspots, which community members identified and experts identified as, but there's further research that's needed to identify where those might be, such as like highways or other particular parts of the community. And then additionally,
Maybe if I could just,
of
could I
course,
just say
yeah.
one quick thing about that too? I think that, we've learned in Minnesota that there's been a lot of challenges with extractive industries. And when like a big oil pipeline project comes through or another project where there's a man camp, an air quotes set up where, a couple hundred, a couple thousand guys come and move into a community to do this manual labor work. that a lot of times there's increased problems with trafficking that go along with those types of industries that, you know, you can be aware of and provide additional training and expectations for the companies, frankly, that are coming in and bringing these workers into the communities that a lot of times are in Indian country. And then, so just like trafficking hotspots, another area that we've identified in Minnesota that we try to work with the tribes on is casinos and hotels, and particularly casinos and hotels that are already have been identified, you know, as having issues with trafficking, what additional training or supports can be provided for the workers there to help identify that situation and know how they can work with law enforcement when a situation like that is identified.
Did Caitlin have a question?
Hang on.
online?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think Caitlin had a question.
Caitlin, go ahead.
Yeah, just to clarify on that front, from what I'm reading and what I'm hearing you say, it sounds like these recommendations are specific to the sexual exploitation type of trafficking. Are there any recommendations specific to labor trafficking, which we do have a significant issue in the state of Utah because of agricultural and some of those other things you pinpointed? But it sounds like these recommendations deal more with the sexual exploitation side of human trafficking.
I would say that's accurate. That's accurate, yes.
Speak into the microphone. so-
Yep, this is more focused on sexual exploitation and trafficking than labor trafficking, although certainly that could come into play as well, but we didn't explore that as much in our research.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And then finally, we also identified that there's opportunities to take a closer look at and potentially adjust the duration of protection orders that are set in jail release agreements. So if someone's been arrested for alleged domestic violence, law enforcement can provide survivors of that violence with a protective order for, I believe the standard is 30 days. But we understood through speaking with experts that it generally takes at least 45 days for that person who's been accused of domestic violence to be seen in court. And so there's a gap in the protection for that person where the protection order is not in effect anymore. And additionally, there's opportunities to develop domestic violence specific risk assessment protocols so when offenders or alleged offenders have been arrested and law enforcement conduct a risk assessment that looks at their risk of various things like their flight risk and things like that. And experts pointed out that they may look like a low-risk person in many aspects of their life, like they hold down a stable job, other positive things, but they felt that the existing risk assessment protocols don't necessarily capture their risk of recommitting domestic violence against a partner or another person in their household.
So this has been an area that I've focused on with Representative Weiler, and we've passed some legislation looking at jail release programs and protective orders, and there's been other people that have continued to work on this. And this last session, we did some lap training for law enforcement. So when you're talking about the risk assessments, you're looking specifically at the alleged perpetrator in the situation?
Yeah, so the lethality assessment protocols were a huge step forward, and we think that's a huge strength that Utah has in place right now. And so these domestic violence specific risk assessment protocols would come into, so the LAP would be at the time of arrest, and then the domestic violence specific risk assessment protocol would come into play when they're considering whether to release them from law enforcement custody.
Thank you
So at a
for the
later stage.
clarification.
Oh, of course.
Ozzy, would you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I had a question about when you're talking about protective orders, what is your understanding of the tribal protective orders and how they are transferred to the state system and how they are implemented and carried out in the state, and what is that like today?
We understand that law enforcement agencies across the state use a wide variety of data management systems, and I believe we did hear from experts that there are gaps and barriers to communication about protective orders across jurisdictions in Utah. In particular, we've heard from survivors who have protective orders that they faced a lot of barriers to getting them in place across jurisdictions. So I think that's an opportunity to further explore and strengthen Utah's response and support
Thank you.
for survivors. Yeah. And then finally, in terms of media reporting, it was brought to our attention through our follow-up discussion about these recommendations that journalists, when reporting on individual cases or on the MMIR issue, frequently provide references to domestic violence or sexual assault organizations nationwide, but there's a need to highlight supports and resources that are culturally specific to tribes in Utah, and such as the Restoring Ancestral Winds hotline that was recently developed. And these could be a source of greater support to Utah communities. And so when speaking to media about these cases, making referrals to these sources would be very helpful.
So those are the recommendations that are included in the final draft report, which was shared with you all on Friday afternoon. Thanks, Charlie, for sending that out. And again, we just wanted to check in and see if there's anything that we need to change in the recommendations or anything else in the report, because our contract is ending within a week. And so we want to finish the report and get you all a report that you're satisfied with and that you feel good about the recommendations, and that basically everyone on this task force feels like they can stand behind and endorse. And so that's the first question for discussion. And then I think also just really interested in encouraging you all to move forward by identifying which recommendations you think would be the highest priority for the task force or for the Utah legislature to move forward on, and then perhaps to even identify what would be the very next step or steps and who's the person responsible for those, so that you can just begin to start moving forward on some of these recommendations. I think that that's one thing that it could be potentially overwhelming, because there are a lot of recommendations and some of these things are really pretty hard to do, but to just get a little bit of traction and pick which things, you think like, let's just take a couple things and do these first and keep making progress that way would be kind of what we're encouraging you to do here today by talking through these items. So, and I just want to say thank you for listening, thank you for your time and everybody's support, and Charlie and Amy, and of course Yolanda from RAW, and all the task force members who are here, and the folks who participated in the listening sessions and the public comment. We're really grateful with all the information and expertise that you shared that helped us put these recommendations in front of you today.
I think you've done a great job, and I think that we really need to, every state needs to participate, because once they leave this state, they usually leave the state that they're in, I assume. When they get kidnapped or whatever, they try to, so, our surrounding states need to participate as well, so that we're all kind of looking out for the same issues.
There are, a lot of states do have task forces in various stages, and Minnesota, of course, has an MMIR office that was created after the task force, and the recommendation came out to create an MMIR office from the task force. And so, some states are a little bit further along, but one thing we did as a part of this process that we worked with you all on is in June, we went to Albuquerque and talked with folks from New Mexico and California and Nebraska and about all the work that they're doing related to MMIR, because there's definitely stuff happening in different states that is, and every state is doing it a little differently, so it's really cool to see what states are prioritizing and how they're doing the work.
And that's great, but the problem of it is you don't know who to get a hold of when it leaves, when they go to another state.
Right.
You have no idea what they're.
Well, that's why getting the data entered into NCIC
That's what I'm saying.
is
That's
so
why I think
important.
doing
Yeah.
this, what we're doing is getting, collaborating our efforts together with other states, so that if they leave and go to Colorado, they're on the lookout for perpetrators, or, Idaho or wherever it might be, so anyway.
The NCIC is the FBI's missing persons database, and
Okay.
so once a local law enforcement agency enters that information into NCIC, any law enforcement in the country can see it. And so if they encounter someone in Colorado or
But
Las
isn't
Vegas
this
or
sometimes too little too late? I mean, in most cases, I mean, I don't.
Yep. Well, and especially for individuals, like many of our Indigenous relatives who go missing that are sort of maybe known to be transient, you know, they're kind of living on the streets, or maybe they're known to party, or they've already been associated with law enforcement, known to be involved in trafficking. The extent to which law enforcement will file an immediate missing person report on someone like that versus a different type of a person is one of the inconsistencies or injustices of the, this issue that, you know, it could be addressed with clarifying the missing persons law, that, you know, we want law enforcement to verify that someone is, that even if their whereabouts aren't known to their family, that they're still not endangered before we decide to not put them in NCIC.
Definitely, and I guess we wanted to open it up to other task force members if they,
Yeah, what's
thoughts
your
and
recommendations?
recommendations. Senator Hinkins and I have been working, and we have some of ours, but we want input from all of you. I don't know if anyone wants to go first or has anything else to contribute.
Is there anybody online that's on those three questions that they, Yolanda?
Thank you, Senator. First and foremost, I really want to express my deepest appreciation for the state of Utah's investment in Indigenous people regarding the topic of missing and murdered in our state, and also want to deeply thank the hard work that was completed by the Wilder Research Group. Both Jesse and Nicole have done a fantastic job. And lastly, those individuals who have participated and informed the report have really been very helpful. I would suggest that as a task force, each of these recommendations are really important. It's really hard for me to say one specific that may be most important that the task force moving forward may concentrate on. I do think that the data component is very important as we, as an organization, nonprofit organization located in Sandy, we are regularly asked to provide data to the state on a number of things. We don't have the internal capacity to do that right now, but even to go to a foundation and get money, we still need to start somewhere. And having data that outlines who is being affected by homicide, what their ages are, what their gender is, what tribal affiliation they are, is at the very most basic pieces of information that is most critical. The other piece that I find would be very helpful is that the piece that has to do with potentially hiring an individual that will work full time, perhaps in CCJJ, to concentrate on the finer points of these recommendations as a full time job. As you know, research is one of the high request areas that in order to form not only state officials, legislators, elected officials, tribes, federal government, data is really the point that seems to be most substantial in convincing folks that there is a problem, and here are the statistics. So having a full-time person provided in CCJJ, I think that's one that is highly qualified, that is familiar with Indigenous communities, that is comes with an awareness of what it means to be and offer culturally specific and relevant services to our populations, I think is really important. So I would say that those two, if not all, are very important recommendations for the task force to consider. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Senator. I did have one more.
Okay.
Let me just say, one more being that last point that Jesse made regarding media. One thing that we see so often regularly is that when there is an issue of sexual assault, domestic violence, sex trafficking highlighted in our our state media, um, our channel 2, 4, and 5, 7, 9, 13, is that we often see the hotline that is listed as with our sister organizations, both UCASA and UDBC, and RAW is not listed. And I think that it's very important that media in this state pay attention when we have these victims of crime who have been affected. I think having the outreach, the hotline number for our organization, with our organization, is going to be very helpful to those who are also tribal members affected by these crimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Tyler?
Yeah, I appreciate that. They've done a lot of work, and I've been in a lot of meetings with the research group and walking through a lot of these issues. And I know from DPS's perspective, we are here to keep Utah safe, and that includes everyone in Utah. And that includes our Indigenous tribal members that call Utah home as well. And I think there's an opportunity here to grab this information that's been provided and identify those gaps, and then have some really clear, specific conversations with our federal, state, local, federal police partners, law enforcement agencies, on how do we collaborate better? How do we close some of those gaps? And then is there legislative intent language that comes out from this to help us focus our efforts? I think some of that certainly comes into play for law enforcement, is what is the intent of the legislature, then how can we execute on that intent? And so thank you for the report. Certainly there's things we can do, and I look forward to making steps in the right direction.
Thank you. Ozzy?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it. I just wanted to say thank you to the Wilder Research Group for the work that you have done. And the work is not done and it's not complete. I wanted to say that. Also, I wanted to go back to the comments made by Senator Hinkins. I appreciate your comments about the different agencies that need to be engaged in the collaboration, as well as Tyler. Appreciate that. I think for me, one of the top priorities is to engage with the tribes one-on-one, face-to-face, and taking these reports and information to them, to their reservations, because they're going to have a different perspective on these issues. The other one is exploring the intergovernmental agreements, as Tyler mentioned. I think those will be key factors when identifying the details about who to call, like Senator Hinkins said. Who do we call when there's a crisis? We don't know who to reach. And I believe that a very specific IGA between the state government and the tribes will be key here. And the last one is I really see how we can be more consistent, proactive about communicating about the death investigations. That is probably one of the biggest concerns for tribal members, is that them feeling like those tragedies haven't been investigated or followed up on. And I believe we owe it to the tribal members and to those community members to actually expand those services. Thank you.
Thank you. Christina? Ms. Groves? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I also wanted to thank Wilder Research because, and I agree with Ozzy that this is a great first step. Being able to, have some, a report that kind of backs up some of the things that maybe some of us that have worked in this field, believed to be able to have, a comprehensive place to be able to start and move forward, and also, kind of an overarching view of what are our first steps? How do we move forward? As I read the report and looked at these recommendations, I echo, what the other task force members have said, that for some of us, we know a lot about this issue, and for a lot of people in the state, that there's not a lot of information about this issue. So being able to kind of figure out what is our plan to educate people about this issue? Why is this important to both Indigenous people and non-Native people? And how do we work together and build relationships to move forward? I also like the part about, building trusting relationships. That is difficult for a lot of Native people because of our history. But this is not only a Native issue, it's an issue for our community. When our community members are missing or murdered, that impacts everybody. And so being able to figure out how do we move forward and build relationships where we are trying to shine a light on this issue, work together to address this issue, and figure out, for me, representing the urban service community, how do we heal from this issue? And it's a very complex issue, because while our people are missing, it's hard for us to heal. But moving forward, that is something that our communities need to work together to figure out. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. What's that? Anyone from the public would like?
I think we saw one more task force member.
Oh, please.
I just want to just state again what Yolanda stated about the position being created in CCJJ, because I think it would be essential for that position, because just like any of the other boards with like HHS, tribes have their own boards there. So then the tribes, because I know with Utah tribal leaders, a lot of times it's kind of overwhelming with everything they're doing. So if there was a position created at that level, at least they would have a person on that board that represented that tribe that they felt comfortable sending and they knew was sending, that could report directly back to them. So I think that creation of that position will allow tribes to feel like they're being included in this discussion, because a lot of times they don't, and I know that they don't. And there's only so much they can do. Even though they appointed me to sit here, it's still a lot for them and a lot of information for them to receive at one time and to disseminate that information down. So I think that position particularly is critical and should be funded.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.
Okay. See no other questions?
Just open
Great.
it up to the public, and then I have
Okay. Anyone
few
from the
words.
public? Anyone online?
So going off of the recommendations from Yolanda, from the Urban Indian Center, from all of our members that are up here, I've opened up a bill file. I think Senator Hinkins will most likely be my Senate sponsor unless he refuses.
I do whatever you tell me to do. You know that.
But yeah, but we're going to expand the task force for another 2 years, just because we want to make sure that we're going and doing the individual visits with different leaders and communities, as we mentioned, that was mentioned by Ozzy. The other thing with that bill is we're going to ask for a position through CCJJ, so it'll be, both of those asks will be in that bill, and it's being drafted right now. And so I just wanted the task force members to know that we went ahead and we've started to work on that to extend the task force, because there's a lot of work ahead of us, and Charlie's heard from a lot of different leaders and from a lot of different members, and even individuals within an urban setting that are Indigenous. And so we want to make sure that as we transition to, with the funding and approval of our colleagues, this full-time position, and we as a task force slowly transition out, but there's an overlap between the task force transitioning out and that person coming in into a full-time position through the executive branch. That's it.
And I think that Ms. Groves basically said it. It's not just impacting this committee. It's not just the missing Indigenous women and people. It's for, we've got a lot of people that's coming to Utah that's from other countries and don't have a clue of where they are. And I think that the impact to our citizens and even just our people that are born and raised here. I mean, there's a lot of this human trafficking going on. We had bigger offenses for stealing horses and cattle than we did for this because it's never happened. I mean, it's just something that's just, society's gone nuts on a deal like this, and we've got to get ahead of it before, we want to make sure that people know that Utah is not the place to do this kind of mischievous stuff.
And we know with human trafficking, myself and Senator Weiler have worked on a lot of the human trafficking elements. And we are able now, if anyone's under the age of 18, they're considered a human trafficking victim when we're talking about commercial sex. But I know there's some things we still have to do on that front. And so that's why this person is so critical in the CCJJ, with them being in that, so they can, that position, so they can coordinate with Indian Affairs, so they can coordinate with the Urban Indian Center, they can coordinate with our tribal communities, they can coordinate with law enforcement, and we're there as helping guide those conversations. But really, I appreciate everyone on this task force for all the work you've put into this. I know it's been, we started the task force and COVID hit, so it was a little bit difficult. I want to thank the Wilder Institute. We were lucky enough to secure funding for you to help us with the starting point, but we know that this is a systemic issue, and we understand the historical trauma involved with that too. So we really felt, Senator Hinkins and I, that we didn't want to disband the task force as we originally thought, because once we read your report, we had a lot of work to do. And so we'll extend the task force, but we'll also be asking for that full-time position. So we encourage the community and all of you that are here to help us get that funding. So thank you.
Okay.
And I know we have a press conference at 1, so I don't know if maybe if there's any other business, or we can adjourn early.
Yolanda, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Representative Romero. One other point I think that does resonate is that I'm pretty hopeful about the law enforcement and DPS piece. In speaking, we do work with tribes all across the state, and in speaking with some of those who are the leaders for tribal law enforcement, they also remain open and optimistic about strengthening that relationship, as well as reinforcing and helping with some of the training that we can provide perhaps for state law enforcement. And so we're working on some of those things now, and I'm hopeful about the future to perhaps sign an MOU and do a cross commission, as I've heard tribal leaders talk about that also in the past. And I think I would hope that we can be open and continue to be hopeful about strengthening, again, those relationships with tribal law enforcement and state law enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That conclude our meeting, and thanks again for being here. I appreciate you
Thanks for having us.
coming to Utah. Great place to be.
It is a great place to visit.
Yeah.
We've had good trips so far.
And for our task force members, we are going to do just an update with the press at 1 o'clock in the Capitol boardroom, which is on the second floor,
Down right below us here.
right below us on the second floor.
With that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion to adjourn.
Motion.
Say, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Non-debatable. We are adjourned.